welcome to our first book club meeting of the year. And of course, we will be discussing Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, the original book, not the screenplay. I'm just kind of curious, like, how many different versions people have. So if everyone wants to like hold up their version, I'd love to see like how many different ones we've got going on here. See, 1, 2, 3, 4. Gosh, at least 4. Oh, I'm seeing a 5th one. Why are there so many different versions?
I remember back in the day, you could only get the one that Jordan's holding. Like that was the one,
Oh,
and it was
yeah?
like soft cover. Oh,
Yeah.
classic.
I like the one where it's like the 3-book set with
Oh.
and they're like all kind of like green and purple colored.
Yeah. Allie's got like the illustrated one too. Like there's so many different
Right.
editions.
Oh, that's beautiful. Oh gosh, I need to get that one.
I have
All
mine
right.
mine signed by a bunch of Harry Potter actors, but I don't know who they are. I'm like, whose signatures are these?
Oh no.
I just took it to a LeakyCon one year and I was like, sign Fantastic Beasts because it's my favorite book, but
Oh
I don't know who they are.
I hope that all the versions have like the same text and everything in them. I'm not sure if there were any like updates, but hopefully that won't be an issue.
The most recent one has the American magical creatures added that these ones don't.
Oh, okay. So we will probably not be discussing those unless anyone wants to bring them up as their favorite creature or something like that, because those were not in my book.
Nice.
All right. So obviously, first question from this book. I want to know some of our favorite creatures and why they are our favorites.
It's so hard to choose just one, right? But I have to go with the classic Fwooper, just because for folks who don't know, the Protego Foundation, we used to be branded as the Fwooper Foundation. And I still, even reading it this time, resonate with their story. The fact that they have a song and a voice that is so powerful, and that they're often sold with silencing charms on them. It was just, I love them so much. And I every time I go to Universal Studios in Orlando and I see the Fwooper in the window, I'm always just like, look at you. So I have to go with Fwooper. Every time I come across the Fwooper section in this book, I'm just like, yeah.
Yeah. I feel that so much. Lucy, go ahead.
Hiya. I think for me, it has to be the Augury because it is so misunderstood. And the whole mythology about it foretells death, and therefore that was a risk to wizards. And then upon later research, you realize actually it foretells the weather and rainy conditions. And you can compare it to, say, creatures such as Eyes, where they have mythology which says they foretell death, and therefore that was a reason to cause harm to them, kill them. So it is really interesting.
What was that second creature you mentioned?
So Eyes, so they're primates in Madagascar, and they have a mythology around them where they were to foretell death. They're the ones with the really long extended middle fingers that sort of tap on hollow bark, those ones. And that was part of the concerns that they had in conservation. It was the traditional mythology stating that they were foretelling death.
Wow. I mean, that almost sounds kind of similar to like people's superstitions surrounding like black cats and everything. Allie, go ahead.
So I think I don't know if favorite creature, it's so hard to pick, but the one that I've been thinking about the most recently is the fire crab. I just did a presentation on them in one of my animal rights classes, and just kind of their similarities to the hermit crab, because they're usually hunted and taken for their shell, which hermit crabs are a lot of times, well, they're always taken from the wild and sold in pet stores, but they're also sold for their shells depending on what kind of shells that they find. Yeah, and I think that's just, I like the sort of the comparison there because I love hermit crabs.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a Easter egg in the queue for Hagrid's Magical Creatures Motorbike Adventure, one of the rides at Wizarding World, and you see a fire crab shell up on the wall. And it looks just as beautifully ornate as it's described in the book. And I was like, oh, wow, fire crab.
Nicole mentioned in the chat that fire crabs, like in this book, it talks about them having a reservation, and it's one of the few creatures that seems to kind of be given by wizardry like that, like protection. Yeah, so I think that's nice too. So I kind of want us to talk a little bit about what we think that Newt's tone was in writing this book. Because for me personally, I kind of see book Newt and film Newt as like two separate people. Their tones towards the Fantastic Beasts tends to be kind of different. So I was just wondering, like, book Newt, what do we think that he thinks of these creatures? Like, what do we think is his opinion of them? Is he looking at them merely academically? Does it seem like he's talking about them in a more caring way? What do we think of how he uses the words like pest and pest control to describe, you know, how some of the creatures are dealt with? So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear those as well. Let's see, Nicole, we haven't heard from you yet. Go ahead.
So I'd say one of the big things is movie Newt seems to have a lot more sort of close personal relationship with the animals that he's talking about, versus book Newt is a lot more, it's at the very least written from a perspective with significant emotional detachment from the creatures that he's talking about. Whereas book Newt seems to be, or movie Newt is extremely emotionally invested with them, like to the point where he's like has better relationships with a lot of the creatures than he does with most people. Whereas book Newt seems to be the type of person who has more people relationships than creature ones, because you also have the fact that it does have a bit more neutral tone to a lot of things that movie Newt did a lot more to actively campaign against, where you have a lot more generally neutral to the use of animals, products in things, as well as sort of relocating them from their initial environments. Whereas movie Newt spends a lot of time, like for instance, the first movie, the entire reason he comes to America is to rehome a lost animal, or a trafficked animal, I guess more accurately. Whereas book Newt doesn't seem to do that, and is a bit more like, I found a thing, let me tell you about it. And a lot more sort of third-party testimonials. Like for instance, there's an extended section where it's supposed to be like a third-party like record of, here's a story I heard about the lethofolds, I think it was, the blanket things that you sort of die by them loving you to death or laying on top of you. Whereas movie Newt would seem to be the type of person who would have more personal anecdotes.
Good point. I feel that explanation and that point of view like 100%.
I wonder if Newt had to dial in his own personal feelings when writing this book. And maybe we, as Wizarding World fans, now we're seeing the true Newt Scamander in the films depicted, right? So maybe he's trying to, I'm not sure, look as if he's coming at the topic unbiasedly, right? And is now maybe through the films, we're seeing his actual true feelings, how he feels, how emotionally tied he is to the magical creatures that he's writing about. I wonder if that's maybe why he seems so different between the two mediums, is maybe he's like, I have to build some kind of credibility. This is my first book and I'm trying to change people's minds. So I have to take a more academic, unbiased approach when talking about these animals. That's what I was trying to rationalize as I read it this time, was why is there such a disconnect between the Newts? So.
And I wonder if obviously a lot of Team Protego is involved in book publishing. And so even though like, Newt's the author, sometimes he may have been told to like, write it more academically, write it more as like a self-help on how to deal with creatures for wizards and witches book, so that could have played into why the tone seems to be a bit different from like the portrayal we see in the movies. Yeah. Let's see, Nicole Herring, go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, Catherine, I think this is such a cool question to kind of peel out the differences and nuance between the two Newts. So kudos Protego on a great question. I was going to say exactly what Tyler said, although not as articulately as Tyler had just said. But it's so interesting too to see the treatment of animals within literature versus academic, fictionally academic pieces. And even as some of us were answering that initial question too. Some of us were talking about the creatures versus some of us were talking about the characters like Dobby. So I don't know, I don't have a response. I'm just echoing what Tyler said and throwing a little bit of applause to the Protego for the question. Thank you guys.
Oh, thanks. It wasn't just me. It was the team thinking of it, but yeah. It's definitely like one of the biggest things that like I noticed when I was reading or rereading this book. I was like, especially since rereading it came after having watched the films, I was like, wait a second, this is like almost like tonal retconning in a way. But yeah, it was very interesting to me, and I really wanted to hear people's thoughts on it. I didn't want to be alone in that thinking. Any other thoughts on that sort of like dichotomy and what we think of how the book was written? No? Okay, cool. I mean, this is sort of along the same lines, but do we think that Book Newt has any like biases either for or against any certain creatures in this book? Or do we think he was like fair in his description of all of them kind of like across the board?
I'll give it a bash. Yeah, I think a lot of it is directed by the Department of Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, I think. You start off, we're talking about, it's a very academic at Hogwarts, and we're talking about how we've got a Ministry of Magic classification, which ranges from animals being described as boring, all the way up to skilled wizard may handle and control, to then impossible to train or domesticate. And it's all about the relationship with the creatures and to how we as magical people can control them. So I think that is what is set out throughout the book. It makes it seem very academic, very, this is this, this is that. With the centaurs, for example, I think there's a bit more leeway. They discuss about how the centaurs, they have a known wizard killer / impossible train or domesticate rating or dangerous rating, because they deem more respect along with mer people. And I think we go into sort of the foreword and talking about how we came to these classifications of being and beast. You understand that a lot more. I'm not sure what anyone else thinks on that point.
Actually, yeah, no, now that you mention it, I think this book did a good job of kind of, even in the introduction and like the foreword and everything, kind of explaining like the classifications and why certain animals maybe were written about in a certain way, because maybe they do deem like extra care in dealing with them. So that's a really, really good point, really good observation.
Yeah, this is a really good question, because I'm trying to figure out how Newt is maybe reporting certain biases of the time, right? If there are any. For example, his constant use of the word "it" to describe, a magical creature or something, that's obviously a product of its time. It's only, pretty recently that we've started having conversation around the language that we use in regards to magical creatures and animals, using proper pronouns or using gender neutral pronouns. And I think that this was maybe Newt's first attempt at this. And we do know that there are later editions of the book, right, that do come out with updated information. And I wonder, I just wish that maybe we could see the most recent version of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, where it is in 2021, right? Mm-hmm. And what major changes, because I feel like that Newt is somebody who would update the text with the time. And Newt seems to have been so far ahead, and so progressive during his, even now, when this book was first written, that I would imagine that he would keep that going as the conversation around magical creatures continued to grow, right? So maybe there were a couple references to like pests or being status, that kind of thing. But, I'd wonder if after a while he would just kind of inject more of his own personal evolution towards the progressive feelings that he might have towards magical creatures in later editions. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And especially because, like, obviously, as the book mentions, like the wizarding laws and protections and regulations were constantly evolving. So you would have to imagine that, like, the language they use to describe creatures and the way wizards see these creatures would also be evolving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that'd be really cool, because I think this is what in the book it says it's like the 50 something edition.
Yeah, something like that.
There's a lot. That's a lot of reprinting and reworking and
yeah.
Oh, Nicole, looks like you have something to say.
Yes, because I guess the one thing I was also going to bring attention to was sort of in the foreword of the book. Like, there's a whole Newt has like a whole section written about like why magizoology matters, and sort of a lot of it does sort of come up sort of from the from a lot more of a bit more of like what we think of now as Newt's perspective, and it sounds a lot more him, because it has is it okay if I read like a sentence from it?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. No, because it's just sort of like, why do we continue to attempt to preserve and conceal magical beasts, even those that are savage and untamable? Well, the answer is, of course, to ensure that future generations of witches and wizards enjoy their strange beauty and powers as we have been privileged to do, which I feel is a lot more of a Newt take, where it is just sort of more of a, like, why is magizoology important? It's important because, like, it's important to preserve these creatures. And I feel Movie Newt is very much a conservationist first.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that brings up another question I had actually had kind of on our list of questions, like with that quote, where he kind of expresses like the point of magizoology is for future generations to enjoy these creatures. And I'm like, is that really why magizoology should be studied? Like, or because that's almost like saying the point of magizoology is for wizards' benefit of having these beautiful, amazing creatures. Like, why wouldn't it be instead for the sake of just preserving or like allowing these creatures to continue to exist? It's kind of also similar, like in the real world, where people are like more, I guess, ready to help protect animals that they see as like pretty or cute or whatever, that rather than being like all animals like should exist for their own sake, not just so we can enjoy them. Like, it kind of robs them of their agency a little bit. So that was kind of something I wanted to also touch on as well. Like, that quote particularly like stood out to me. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Because I feel like it also, like, you do kind of have a where the you're coming from, where the magical world is in their own state of how they currently treat and think of animals. And I, especially considering timeline of this book, you'd have, based off when this one came out and sort of like what things they mention having already happened in this book in the like Harry Potter notes, is you're still looking pretty early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you think of where like the Muggle world was in terms of animal rights in the early 90s, you are going to still have the fact, like, just, you are very much still at the point of campaigning for, hey, it's important for, like, we need to save the tigers because, hey, tigers are pretty cool. Or let's save the whales because whales are awesome. And you do sort of need, and you kind of need to have enough buy-in on those sort of like, hey, it'd be pretty nice to get to keep all of this stuff around for later, before you can kind of get more people involved in the idea of, hey, and maybe these things should also just get to exist because they already do, and we shouldn't kill them.
Very well said. No, I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. Like we still do need to remember, like, especially me, that it's a product of its time. Like if we're thinking about it, it's back in the 90s and the thinking was definitely very different then. Tyler, go ahead.
As usual with these book clubs, it's as if Nicole has like legitimated my mind and has taken that is exactly what I think this is. This is Newt Scamander trying to appeal to the majority, right? By saying, hey, how cool is it that we have magical creatures? Sure would be a shame if future generations didn't get to enjoy them, right? And he has an ulterior motive, right? He's trying to first introduce this idea of protecting magical creatures, into this wider wizarding world that does not give two wands about them, right? But yet here he is with his own agenda that we kind of see in Fantastic Beasts the films now, that he has the audacity, and I say that in a good way, to really put his neck out on the line in so many different ways to protect magical creatures. It would be almost foolish of us to think that Newt Scamander didn't have some kind of big plan when he was writing, those kind of sentences. Because at face value, us as activists, we get our haunches kind of up a little bit. We're like, what are you trying to say? But I think Newt Scamander is maybe a little deeper of a thinker than we might give him credit for.
Perhaps so. Lucy asked in the comments, do you think Newt is radical in this statement by appealing to the masses? That's a good question. Lucy, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think there are moments, even though I think, as we discussed earlier, there's a disconnect between what we see in film Newt and what we see in book Newt. You do see these slight undertones of radical. And at this time, if you're thinking I think when this book was initially written, it was in the 30s, 40s. That is a radical statement to say that we want to preserve these creatures not for our use, but for their beauty. And even though now we might cringe at that thought, it is quite radical for him at that time. And like you say, it is appealing to the masses. It's very subtle, it's very undertone, but it gets the message across.
So there were definitely some egregious things that Newt did still talk about in this book that I feel obviously relate to some things in our world, like certain ways that wizards have to, or feel that they have to, like, modify creatures or hide them in order to make them like either less visible to muggles or less damaging, I guess, to wizards. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to talk about any examples they found in the book of that happening. I mean, for example, Tyler earlier brought up the Fooper, who is usually sold with a silencing charm placed on them. Because like through no fault of its own, it's just doing its thing and singing loudly. But wizards have, decided that, hey, that's too dangerous for us. So in order for us to have them as pets, we need to, make them silent rather than, sending them to a reservation where no one's going to hear them or something like that. So I was wondering, like, if anyone else wanted to talk about some other examples that they came across of that sort of wizarding world mindset.
The Krupp, I think, is a really, like, that one always jumps out to me, and I'm trying to remember exactly how Newt phrases it, but that they're basically just like a little dog, like a little wizard dog, right? And the really only big difference is that they don't like muggles and that they have a split forked tail, and so they have to have their like tail docked, right? With a painless severing charm, blah blah blah. Yeah. That one, while not on its surface, it doesn't seem, particularly cruel, especially when we're talking about like fire crabs and having like their shells used for potions, or, the Hooper being silenced. But that one, to me, struck me as completely unnecessary. a forked tail, like that's really the only difference between a Jack Russell Terrier and a Krupp. Like you can't just say my dog was born with two tails. Like,
Yeah.
sorry, like and not to mention, we know that people experienced and learned it in magic have amazing abilities when it comes to, disillusionment charms and all these different things. Just a little disillusionment charm if you're going to walk your dog in a muggle inhabited area, and so that way they only have one tail. Do we really need to sever that tail? So that's one of the first things that kind of comes to my mind, is like the idea of this body modification for this little magical creature who, when it's completely really unnecessary. There are alternatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's basically like the exact opposite take, but the thing that's right above Krupps in the book are called Clabberts, and basically their whole story is the fact that people used to put them in their trees to like warn them against muggles, and then everyone thought it was Christmas lights, and then they had to stop doing it because people kept complaining about people keeping their Christmas lights up, which is like the opposite happy side of it, which I feel like after everything we could all use a bit of a happy right now.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, like that's interesting. I wonder if the Clabberts like kind of did that on their own, just like exist in the trees on their own, or if they were like kind of enlisted in a way to do that. But yeah, that's apparently there's like they look to muggles like normal Christmas lights, and that's kind of cool, like camouflage. So I think we've talked about this before in other book club meetings, about like the whole reservations system and whether we think that that's helpful for certain animals or not. So some examples would be like for dragons or snidgets, and then I can't remember who talked about fire crabs having a reservation. Do we think that those are successful? Do we think that they're necessary? Any thoughts on those? I mean, I'll go with a first thought. For example, the snidgets, because I also love snidgets. Again, bird creatures. So they were kind of like, I feel like they were, if I read correctly, kind of brought to almost extinction, because of being used for feathers, their eyes, Quidditch. But those global reserves, like, which I think are mentioned as being like the most extensive of any creature reservation in the wizarding world, kind of brought them back from the brink. And so they're like fully protected now. So in that case, like I see them as a very good thing. But like, for instance, like what do we think about the dragon reservations? Do we think it's stifling for the dragons? Do we think it's necessary to keep them hidden from muggles? Is it in their best interest? Like, if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, this reminded me of, I can't remember which episode it was, but it was Protego Cast season 1, where we're talking about, because like all of this comes down to, honestly, the statute of secrecy, right? So it's like, if muggles are allowed to know about dragons, we don't have to worry about hiding them. And so then they can have their autonomy and like just live their lives instead of having to be hidden away. So then it's like, so then it gets into that conversation of like being pro or against this, statute of secrecy. Because then I also think of like, because I think the mer people in the Black Lake, that's like a reservation for them as well. But then, we didn't care and we got in during the second task anyway. So it was, it's like, I don't know. I mean, Ravenclaw, so I can like logic my way into any answer really, but for me, it always comes back to the statute of secrecy. And if that is what we're trying to uphold, then yes, we do need a safe place for dragons to reside. But then they do lose their autonomy with that, because they probably wouldn't choose to live where they're being forced to by wizards. So
yeah, good point.
I'm going to offer the flip side of that, also on that episode of Protego Cast that I can't remember what we were talking about, but the idea that if the wizarding population is such a small population within the world, right, compared to the larger Muggle population, we can logic our way into kind of like thinking that keeping dragons hidden and all magical creatures hidden is way better for the magical creatures than it is to let them out kind of into the world, right? This idea that if we are to compare what we do to non-magical creatures right now, and if we were to think about that, what would we do to dragons? What would we do to snidgets, to all these other magical creatures, right? At what point is it better that maybe we do always continue to hide magical creatures, not for, our own kind of periphery benefit as a wizarding community, right? But truly for their own, right? Because if we can keep them hidden from the global majority of the world that would choose to exploit them or slaughter them or whatever, then I think that might be the best thing. And then just work amongst the wizarding community itself and say, how can we, find alternatives to dragonhide gloves? How can we find alternatives to firecrab potions, cauldrons, whatever, that kind of idea of maybe it is truly. And with that, we do have to recognize that there is a loss of autonomy, right, within the magical creatures themselves. But at the end of the day, we don't live in that kind of perfect world where we can have harmony with ourselves and non-magical or magical creatures. And so at the end of the day, I think it's best that they are hidden, as long as there are wizards and witches and magical people in the community who work to improve the conditions that they're forced to live in.
I agree, because I feel like they would definitely be poached, like without a doubt, and people would be, for dragons specifically, like afraid of them. So what do humans do when they're afraid of another creature that could potentially harm us? Generally, humans will kill them. And it just reminds me of possibly like my favorite or my most interesting quote from the book, when it's talking about the beasts versus beings, and it says, several highly intelligent creatures are classified as beasts because they are incapable of overcoming their own brutal natures. And my thought was just that if that's the case, then humans should be classified as beasts, because we have very brutal natures and we harm probably every single creature in there and in the Muggle world. So yeah, a lot of issues with the beasts and beings system for sure.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Yes, mic drop. Definitely. Valerie coming in with the hot takes.
I'm gonna call you Hot Take Valerie from now on.
Oh yeah, then Melanie mentioned in the chat that it reminds her of the deer call dodo bird comparison, and or like they were supposedly the same thing. And so how the wizards let muggles believe that they actually went extinct in order to protect those that are left. I think that that's actually pretty genius. Like, good on the wizards for doing that. Like, good point. And that actually brings me to another question. Are there any creatures that anyone would like to see being given sort of the benefit of having those reservations, that the book doesn't mention that those exist for them? Because actually, like, there were quite a lot of beasts in here where it was talking about like they're used for their horns, or they're used for other pieces of materials from their body, but then it didn't mention like what was being done to curtail that trade or protect those animals. And I think for me the biggest one is the Arumpents, which, like, we in the past, Protego has done a campaign to kind of highlight the similarity between how the Arumpents are utilized and treated in the wizarding world, and how rhinos, specifically in South Africa, are kind of, looked at the same way by humans as like, oh, we need to use them for their horns. Like, they have, magical healing properties, because actually that's literally what some people think. But like, that type of animal, for me, I would like to see the wizarding world create similar to what exist in the real world with like the rhino sanctuaries. I feel like they, as a species, deserve that protection. So yeah, if there are any other ones that people want to bring up, Nicole Higgins, go ahead.
So this one brings in a bit of the movie canon, but Graphorns, because in the movies, Newt has the last two breeding Graphorns. Yet in his book, he specifically talks about how, Graphorn horn is used in many potions, and its hide is tougher than a dragon's. So it's both so either there are literally one set, which theoretically, based off the timeline, is he would have been writing this book when he had the last two of them, and then did not put and by the way, they're kind of dying, and they are not around there are not enough of them for us to be continuing to do that, because I have the two of them and they are in my suitcase right now.
Good point. More retconning in the wizarding world. Either that or Newt just forgot to put that in his book. Yeah, no, I think that's a great one. Like basically any creature that has been like utilized for their body parts, and it's been like over traded and stuff like that, I think deserves to have some sort of reservations or protections.
Yeah, so something that stood out to me during this reading was the alternative to the wizard created sanctuary, right? When we got to the quintuped section, which love that story. I mentioned this on Chick Peeps once, but I want to get like a quintuped tattoo like on my hand, because they're just like, look at how fantastic they are. Like I love them.
Yeah.
But this story is fascinating, right? But quintupeds largely are kept to themselves, right? Aside from the quintuped skeleton that we see in Half-Blood Prince and the Room of Requirement, we don't really see quintupeds being used. And even this line here in the actual book, they resist every attempt by the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures to capture a specimen and untransfigure them. Like the fact that the quintuped has been able to kind of manage themselves, whether the Harry McBoone story is true or not, as their own independent colony of magical creatures, completely devoid of any kind of wizarding, at least as far as we know. I'm sure that the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures has set up some kind of like, okay, we're just going to leave them be, boom, protection spell, okay, bye.
Yeah, I think it's plottable, maybe
yeah, right. Something has to be there. But the fact that they established that and were able to maintain it, keep out wizards, and live the way that they want to be lived, again, whether or not the Harry McBoone story is true or not, is so cool. And it would be so nice if there was a way that other magical creatures could do that as well, right? We kind of see that with centaurs, granted they're given the Forbidden Forest, go and do what you want within it, right? Same with the mermaids. You're given the Black Lake or the Great Lake, whatever. Go do whatever you want to, go live in there. But this idea that there is a species out there who has completely established their own reservation is so cool. And we as wizard, like magical creature activists, we can show species solidarity by simply, supporting that and saying, I will never go there. I will never go and visit, where you are. And I think the same thing can be true about the Forbidden Forest of the Black Lake, right? You have these areas, we have the entire world. So we're just going to leave you be, let you do your thing, right? But that idea of how cool it would be to have magical creatures set up their own idea of of where they would want to live almost brings a tear to my eye.
Yeah, actually, the thing you mentioned about the Forbidden Forest, it kind of almost does act as a reservation of sorts, or a sanctuary, both for the centaurs, because like that's their territory basically, and then the Acromantula colony that lives there, because no one goes in there when they're in there, or they don't want to go in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's also like definitely like so many creatures that are like so dangerous that even though perhaps they may have magical properties or something, that wizards generally tend to stay away. So like those ones I'm less worried about. Like for instance, the one that came to mind for me was the Chimera. and the book mentioned what, although I kind of don't know why they would go to slay a chimera, maybe it was bothering a village or something, but that there's only been one successful slaying of a chimera. So that leads me to believe that the chimera themselves are like pretty capable of sustaining their own population and keeping themselves safe and everything. And there were definitely other examples of that as well, but that was just the one that popped into my brain. Oh, the one I felt really bad for that I thought needed protection from humans is kind of like in a funny way though. Fairies. Like I get so annoyed, even in the Harry Potter books, every time they would be like, the room was decorated with fairies or the tree was decorated with fairies. I would be like, really? Like you're gonna use actual living beings to like decorate? Like just leave them alone. Let them have their own little forest where they can just be themselves. Although I'm not sure if this book actually mentioned like if they enjoy being lights or something like that, which I hate that as an argument, but sometimes like yeah,
Yeah,
no,
I
it
don't think so, because like where do they live the rest of the time? Actually uses the term decorative beast.
Yeah. I hate that.
The fairy, the small and decorative beast of little intelligence. So apparently that is all
Yeah,
there.
no, they generally inhabit woodlands and glades.
Yeah, because like how Fred and George make one of the gnomes, I think, or was it a doxy or a gnome, like gold, and yeah, so there's probably a spell that's making it that they can't get away from the tree.
Yeah, so I think they deserve their own little sanctuary, so they don't have to become people's decorations. Because to me, that's almost even worse than like having like tradable goods or whatever, because you're actually like using a live being while it's still conscious. And yeah, kind of along the similar track of thought, this book mentions a lot about the Class B tradable materials, which in essence is defined as, you know, materials that are traded but are dangerous and subject to strict control. And based on the descriptions of the materials in this book, I'm just wondering, like, I mean, obviously, as we all think about animal rights things in general anyways, if they're so dangerous and subject to strict control, should they even be traded?
Can you refresh us on the examples of what Class B non-tradable goods are? Because I remember it's like a rumpent horn, acromantula eggs.
Wait, what was the other one you said?
I think it's acromantula eggs.
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's definitely more that I'm fully forgetting.
Oh, sorry. Acromantula eggs are Class A non-tradable goods.
What's the difference for that?
Probably just like different, more strict policies, right? So a Class B would have fewer regulations than like a Class A or a Class S would, which makes sense why an acromantula egg would be a Class A, because what are you going to do with an acromantula egg?
Yeah, good point. Let's see, Romanian longhorn horns, which I believe that's a dragon. Am I mistaken in that? Yeah, it's a breed of dragon. But yeah, basically any of the classes of tradable materials, it's like if they're so dangerous, even though they're useful, like to wizards supposedly, should they be even in the market? And like we actually kind of see an example of that in Deathly Hallows, where a rumpant horn explodes. I mean, this is more of a personal opinion question, I guess, like than a book or plot question. But like to me, I think if something's so rare and endangered and dangerous, then like why would you even bother working with it? Tyler, go ahead again.
I think the reason why there's so much silence amongst us is I think because we can all agree, yeah, why would we? Like if, you know, there are two different issues, right? The dangerousness of the item and the ethical side of it, right? We know that to get a rumpant exploding fluids, Who's taking that? At what point? Is there an industry for it? Because if so, somewhere there are rumpins who are being exploited for it. The trade in rumpant horns. Is it like the trade in rhino horns here in the US, where a rhino's horn is cut off and then they're left to die? At some point, as we talk about these tradable goods as nothing more than just material items, we forget that they have real life impacts on the actual creatures themselves, right? Whether that's acromantula eggs. Who's taking these eggs from these mother acromantulas, and why? Why do we need to? So that's the ethical side of it. But yeah, the dangerous side of it as well. We don't need to bring about more acromantulas in areas where they shouldn't be, right? Or where they're going to be put in a situation where if they go and do their natural instinct, the instinct that is important to them of hunting, gathering, mating, where if they do that, near a population of muggles, they're going to die. They're going to be killed by the Department for the Regulation of Magical Creatures, probably the Dangerous Pest Control Division. And so we're really doing them a huge disservice by trading in these goods, right? These goods that are theirs. Now, so yeah, there are two different sides, but I think that we can all agree that both are just terrible, terrible ideas. And yet again, it's a complete oversight as to what the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures is supposed to be doing at its root, is hopefully not just figuring out how we can use magical creatures, but how we can protect them. So anyway.
That was beautiful. Yeah, actually, while you were talking about that, I even thought of kind of like a third way in that, like that whole system of trading in dangerous materials is actually detrimental to the wizarding world as a whole. It kind of brought to mind the treatment of human workers that deal in, like, for instance, the meat packing industry. Like, when you said who's collecting the acromantula eggs or who's getting the exploding fluid from the rumpant horns, like, I mean, that's like a human worker rights issue. Like, they're being put in a dangerous situation. We don't know if it's like, some highly skilled trained wizard or just, someone who maybe didn't pass all their newts and they've been told you need to go do this grunt work, or immigrants or something like that to a certain area. Like, I mean, there's also, and I know people, and I get on my soapbox about this a lot, who think, oh, animal rights people only care about the animal side of things, but it's like, no, also there's the human part of the equation, where humans are mistreated in the animal cruelty industries, basically. And so I'm imagining that might actually be the same case in the wizarding world. So getting rid of the trade in those materials would actually possibly be beneficial to wizards personally as well. Yeah, that was a tangent, but thanks for sticking with me. Obviously, this book explains a lot about different creatures, some of which we don't see in the Harry Potter books or films. And so it's like very eye-opening in a lot of ways. Do we think that this book in its current version, the way that we see it written here, would persuade other witches and wizards and magical people to think differently about the creatures and to treat them differently? Like, do we think that knowledge would lead to empathy?
I think it would be, I think it's similar to the Muggle world where they're perceived as either objects or something to goggle at a zoo. I always wonder, I think it would be really cool, which it's not going to happen, but if this book got rewritten modern day now, like from the voice of the film version of Newt, because I think it would be completely different. And I think it's just a showcase of like how times have changed, which when did this come out?
I think the original text was 2001.
Yeah, so since then, like the world in general has changed a lot. And I think the writing of, maybe not completely, because I don't think like a vegan would be writing it, but
just taking like the Newt character as he became in the films into account, I think the wording would be a lot different. But as far as like the students who are handed this textbook, no, I don't think, I think it's similar to people in the real world who are like, oh, rhinos are like cool, or like elephants, they're very majestic. But then the smaller, like a rat or just whatever smaller creatures that are classified even as boring, you know, like we can exterminate them, like they're not interesting enough to keep around, basically. So
I totally agree with what Valerie said. And I think if the book was rewritten in a different way, I think it's about storytelling as well. I think people connect so much more with stories and getting to know the individual characters. So when you think of the films and film you're getting involved with Dougal the demiguise and caring about his character and who he is as an individual, because you're seeing the relationship between Newt and Dougal. You're seeing how incredible this magical creature is on their own. Of course, I think that's not enough. And I think, as with anything in animal rights or anything in any social justice movement, it's all about multiple different facets together. Of course, you need knowledge and texts like this to talk about more factual things. Yes, yes, the demiguise is poached for its fur so it can make invisibility cloaks, and that's sad. Yes, we also need to consider the stories and the connections and the personal attributes of a demiguise and the relationship with Newt in selling that story and selling their individuality and personalities to people. But also we need to look at the wider spectrum of things. So it's multiple different assets, I think, that we need to combine together, as we do, like Valerie said, in the real world. You know, people, when we talk about veganism, for example, it's an animal rights liberation movement, of course, and it's very much entangled with social justice in general. We talk about wizard liberation and creature liberation. We're talking about multiple different facets all together to rally around each other. But some people come to veganism, as we know, they'll get introduced with plant-based diet, the plant-based diet, because they care about health, and then they gradually build their way into the environment and then animals, and then all of a sudden, bam, they're fully fledged vegan and committed to changing their lifestyle and advocating for animal rights for the rest of their lives. So I think it's a multifaceted issue, but yeah, definitely rewritten, not on its own. But I'd be interested to see if anyone else does think on its own it's okay or whatnot.
Yeah. And before, Tyler, I'll call on you next. But before that, like going back to kind of what Valerie said, like she made a good point about like this is a textbook basically that's being put into students' hands. And I mean, as we've discussed with Hermione's activism, like at that age, you're not fully like developed and aware of like, even if you're reading about these animals, like realizing the plight that they might be going through, like even if it's mentioned that, hey, this animal is being used for yada, 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 and they're going extinct, like you're not always necessarily going to make the connection with that when you're, a teenager. So like even this book, maybe it would have more impact even with like older wizards, I think, than younger wizards. But then again, maybe not. Maybe there are more Hermiones in the world than we know. And I wanted to mention also, so Nicole, like what you said, this is part of most magical curricula. And the majority of the wizarding world have read this and applied it in care of magical creatures. And yet exploitation, unethical use, abuse of magical creatures still exists. So, I mean, that's basically it. Tyler.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo exactly everything that everybody else said. This is a textbook, so we get very almost bland writing, right? And I get that, the original author of this, it's very short. It's supposed to be a companion piece. But I think that maybe in the real wizarding world, this book has got to be like a tome, right? Just huge, like Order of the Phoenix sized, where Newt goes into every little bit of it. Because I think for this book to have been impactful for for wizards in terms of like changing their empathy towards magical creatures. I forget who said it. I think it might have been Lucy, but it needed stories, right? It needed to read like a documentary almost, right? Like a David Attenborough like documentary, where the real only emotion that we get Newt describing in this book is danger, right? The Kappa, they live here, they look like this, they're dangerous, you know? But how cool would it have been if there was a story like the Kappa lives in the river. She'll carefully nurture her eggs before they hatch 6 weeks later, where they'll follow her mom as she teaches them to fish, or something like that, where we connect with them. We see the Kappa like doing stuff that's not just like how they're going to hurt wizards, but how they interact with their young. How do they survive? What is their mourning like when one of them dies, right? Because we know that elephants mourn. We know that so many different animals mourn. How cool would it be to empathize and relate to this other magical creature who might mourn the same way that we do, right? Or something like that. I think that those stories would need to be in here in order for it to really change the wider wizarding world. Now, I say that, and I think that maybe this was intentional. Maybe if I'm giving Newt, again, too much credit, maybe he didn't want to make the magical creatures too interesting, because maybe he was worried that people would be like, wow, a demiguise sounds amazing. I want to go find them, capture them, and keep them as a pet. At what point was maybe Newt thinking, okay, I'm going to give them the bare amount of information. Here they are. Here's what they look like. They're dangerous. To deter wizards from going out and capturing them. Is there some, and this might just be I'm just going to call it like new empathy conspiracy theory, but this idea that maybe Newt Scamander, again, really is playing the long game and is just trying to be like, okay, this is what they look like. Leave them the F alone. I don't know. That's what I'm sticking with.
That's so interesting. So first of all, I love the idea of adding the stories because obviously this wouldn't be a textbook. And I love the idea that maybe he did expand upon it in the real one. And I think in addition to the stories, he could though say, not your conspiracy theory, but say, because of these reasons, like we should leave them alone. But as it is now, it's basically just like, so this creature is used for this. It's kind of like promoting it the way it's written at the moment. And I don't think that writing them as dangerous is helpful to them either, because then people are going to just automatically have a reaction when they see one and like try to get it away from them by whatever means, killing them or just stunning them or whatever. So I love the idea of this book expanded to have those stories and to give alternatives. Like they can say, unfortunately, dragon hide is used as gloves, but instead there's this other thing that you could use. I think that Newt, the film version of Newt, would totally write that in. But I feel like this author Newt is a different character than the film Newt, because even in the introduction it says like the reason why he wrote this book was because the Ministry of Magic or somebody like the publisher asked him to, and he was a lowly ministry employee who was making 2 sickles a week, so he wanted to make more money. So we know that from the films, at least I perceived from the films, that he was writing the book to educate people about the creatures and why they shouldn't be harmed, as opposed to in this original one, it's a completely different story. So
yeah. And actually, going back sort of to what Tyler was talking about, and well, what everyone's been talking about like having sort of a different version of this book in the wizarding world and like it's more expanded. I'd forgotten that in Albus Dumbledore's foreword to this book, it talks about it being a special edition for Muggles. So there is also the possibility that this book has been very dumbed down and doesn't include many like encouraging descriptions of these creatures, so that were a Muggle to come across one of them, they would recognize it and stay the heck away.
Well, as we continue to talk about, how we could rewrite Fantastic Beasts and where to find them, I did want to quickly plug for our fundraiser last year. We had this idea of a book cover for the first Fantastic Beasts, screenplay, and what would be the actual book that we would want to see, having been written in the wizarding world that takes care of magical creatures, but from, obviously an animal rights perspective. So if you would like to get the Compassionate Compendium of Creature Care book cover, it's on the Protego Foundation shop. And it's a very beautiful, beautiful book cover.
Parth also had a really great comment in the chat here that like, yes, this is a textbook and maybe by itself, like it wouldn't necessarily get kids to be empathetic to these creatures. But if you had a better professor to teach the subject, no matter like what time frame we're talking about in the wizarding world, we're not necessarily railing on any certain professor in specific histories. The children might be able to sympathize more. And that's very true. Like if you have someone in charge of teaching this textbook, even if it is this version that's like shortened and very clinical, then that professor could help the kids connect with these animals more and sympathize with them. So thank you for bringing that up, Parth. That's a really, really good point. I'm not throwing shade at Hagrid, I promise. I still love him. He's just very misinformed. Misguided. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that particular topic? If not, I think that's actually a really, really good place to leave it, because we are actually out of time. So yeah, thank you everyone for being here. This was a very exciting book club. Very fun, very exciting. We talked about some deep stuff. And as always, if you want to learn anything more about the Protego Foundation, or any of the new stuff that we have going on, we've got our website, we've got our socials, we've got our Discord. If you want to help us with our programs, particularly with the book club, we would appreciate if you could donate. You can do it like whatever your favorite Harry Potter book is, 1 through 7. And I think I mentioned the Discord. We were going to be doing like a lot more fun stuff on there, so definitely like join that. And last but not least, our next book club will be on February 26th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific. And we're going to be discussing some sort of Harry Potter fan fiction that is yet to be determined. So keep an eye on our socials. So yeah. Hope to see you all there. Thanks for being here. Yay.